Hi, everyone. My name is Olivia Bridgenell. Thank you to the History Undergraduate Advisory Board for having me, and to everyone for listening to my presentation for this year's Undergraduate History Conference at UCLA. My research project, which I completed for Professor Simon Joseph's History of Religion in the U.S. class, is entitled Native American Methods of Religious Preservation in the 19th and 20th Centuries, and it explores the third theme of this conference, resistance. I argue that the native peoples of continental North America appropriated the religious language of their oppressors in order to preserve their own religious practices and resist criminalization. Then I relate that to the way more modern Indigenous scholars have repurposed certain academic disciplines, instead of the language of the oppressor's religion itself, to reverse the prejudiced narratives that these disciplines historically generated. First, I will discuss the idea of deficit portrayals as well as resilience and resistance. Then I'll introduce my case studies from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which show how Indigenous peoples responded to bans on religious practices and overtly racist biases, both inside and outside US courts. I focus on this time period because the prejudices which were previously embedded in imperial encounters became increasingly overt and legalized. In other words, the United States' oppression of Native Americans became officially inscribed in governing documents at the state and federal levels, with new laws that prohibited Natives from practicing religion, even on reservation land. First, I will examine the 1883 prohibition of the sun dance, a significant ritual among the Lakota tribe, and their resistance of that ban through the ghost dance and the continual practice of the sun dance in secret. Then I will analyze the prohibition of peyote, a hallucinogenic cactus used for religious ceremonies among many tribes, and the resistance of this criminalization with the formation of the Native American Church of Oklahoma. Finally, I will relate this type of resistance to the later 19th century contributions of the Indigenous scholar Vine Deloria. First, I wanted to acknowledge the inordinate difficulty and oppression that Native Americans faced from the time of English colonization, which started with the first permanent settlement of Jamestown in 1607. Conquest, displacement, and imperial domination defined the recurrent encounters between Indigenous peoples and English colonists, and it mainly stayed this way with the change in political power after the American Revolution. Some scholars, such as Catherine Burnett, show that a quote-unquote deficit portrayal, or the constant association between a group and problems, quote, can stigmatize and further marginalize groups. Therefore, while acknowledging these oppressions, this project instead attempts to emphasize Indigenous resistance, resilience, adaptation, and agency. Next, we will go through the two case studies, which will cover the ban on certain religious practices and the Indigenous peoples' responses to these bans. Under the pressure of Christian reformers, US President Ulysses Grant appointed a board of commissioners of Indian commissioners in 1869. Then in 1883, the United States formed the Indian Religious Crimes Code, which banned the sun dance, which was a significant ritual among the Lakota tribe, and it also banned many other religious rites. This development marked a new era in American policy that emphasized Native confinement and the so-called civilization of Native culture in reservations. Therefore, the American policy shifted from blatant violence to covert violence at the controllable setting of a reservation. The new code included the creation of Indian agents who monitored the Native Americans and oversaw punishment for breaking the code. For instance, they would withhold rations to coerce compliance, and they reunited Indian police to enforce the rules and policies. Despite these new measures, the Lakota continued to perform the Sundance in secret. For instance, an agent reported the resurfacing of the Sundance at Standing Rock in 1914, 30 years after another agent declared the dance extinct at that same reservation. Thus, the Lakota at Standing Rock preserved the Sundance for over 30 years without detection. Not only was this secret preservation of the Sundance a major act of resistance, but it was an effective method of survival and preservation of their traditional spiritual beliefs. Considering the intensity of the cultural genocide program, only some Lakota groups were able to preserve the Sundance itself in secret, and this prevented the main intent of the dance, which was to annually affirm their tribal identity and solidarity. To fulfill this communal function of the sun dance, the Lakota began adopting the ghost dance in 1889, 6 years after the initial ban. A Paiute holy man named Wovoka created the dance to reunite the living and the dead spirits and bring about a new world after supposedly having a divine vision which involved Jesus and God. Lakota delegates visited Wovoka and adopted the dance. This new dance synthesized the indigenous people's wish for the renewal of the earth to its pre-colonial state and the idea of Christian millennialism, or some form that there would be a paradise on earth occurring before Jesus' second coming. Therefore, the indigenous peoples repurposed Christian ideas in attempts to resist acculturation and continue their traditions. The ghost dance thus exemplifies how the oppressed religious minority produced new customs, which drew on the oppressor's customs, but especially preserved important parts of their tradition. The US military repressed this ghost dance just as they had repressed the sun dance, as soon as the Lakota recovered it from Wovoka. Although the Christian influence was present, it was either undetectable or it was merely insignificant to the American agents. In fact, this conflict led to extreme violence in 1890 when the US cavalry captured and massacred several hundred Lakota who practiced the ghost dance, and this is now known as the Wounded Knee Massacre. Despite the violent program of cultural genocide, indigenous people exemplified the power of resistance in this case study, and also today, as some tribes such as the Caddo continue to practice the ghost dance. While the 1883 Religious Crimes Code mainly targeted religious rituals such as the sun dance, it also ambiguously criminalized almost all religious rites, and it specifically directed the agents to focus their attention on the, quote, medicine man. Thus, the use of peyote for religious rituals also came under scrutiny, causing much controversy and persecution. The code enabled and emboldened agents to confiscate any peyote that they found, and in February 1918, the House Committee on Indian Affairs convened the US congressional hearings on peyote. The hearing did not result in a national ban, but several states listed here banned peyote in the following years. This hearing was thus just one of the many debates about peyote over several decades. Immediately following the congressional hearing in 1918, many leading peyotists from Oklahoma, which was the state with the most concentrated number of peyote supporters, assembled to discuss how they would once and for all convince all state governments and the federal government that peyote was not a narcotic and deserved First Amendment protection. They decided to then form the Native American Church of Oklahoma. From its foundation, the Native American Church appropriated Christian ideas to make indigenous spirituality familiar to Christians and the US government. Although Native Americans do not usually relate to the doctrinal belief systems, because in their worldview there is no separation between spiritual practice and daily life, they adopted these more doctrinal religious frameworks and Christian language to demonstrate to the United States that their beliefs were indeed organized and codified. For example, ceremonies involved officiants who demonstrated the organized oversight of specialized leaders. They used specific artifacts that marked ceremonies as consistent and organized. And lastly, they were evangelical in the sense that they welcomed newcomers. Much of this new structure resembles Christian tradition, and even the name Native American Church demonstrates how natives directly adopted language from the Christian tradition to gain support. Although several states banned peyote during the Prohibition era, the lobbying of the Native American Church prevented a nationwide ban. And in 1994, amendments to the American Indians Religious Freedom Act of 1978 protected the use of peyote. Additionally, the church also fostered pan-Indigenous solidarity as a form of resistance, which lasts until today. Natives from the Delaware, Caddo, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ponca, Oto, Pawnee, and Osage tribes joined the church, and it spread nationwide. The Native American Church always remained a distinctly Indigenous space, and membership is common among Indigenous people of the US and Mexico today. This marks it as a powerful subversion of the narrative of Indigenous inferiority. In the court hearings of the early 20th century, Native Americans were repeatedly called a drug-addled group, but it was this supposedly incapable drug-addled group that not only repurposed Christian elements to protect Indigenous religion, but also thrived independently without any Christian institutional support. Finally, later writers similarly co-opted historical tools of oppression, which had previously delegitimized and criminalized indigenous religion. The main example of this is native scholar Vine Deloria, who repurposed Western anthropology and comparative religion to criticize the notion that indigenous religion is inherently inferior to Christianity. For some brief context, anthropology involved normative evaluations of some cultures over others upon its conception, and anthropologists often incorporated racist ideologies until the mid to late 20th century. Therefore, anthropological studies and comparatives between Christianity and indigenous beliefs historically affirmed preconceived biases. In his close comparison of indigenous religion and Christianity, Deloria flips the normal narrative and uplifts native religion and criticizes Christianity. For instance, Deloria claims the Christian tradition in which God is perceived as a father, quote, de-emphasized the family, end quote, as only a two-generational unit, while the, quote, Indian concept of the deity as a grandfather or grandmother opens up considerably more flexibility, end quote. He also repurposed the academic practice of historical analysis to undermine the myths of the vanishing Indian and manifest destiny, or the idea that natives simply vanished to accommodate God's plan of westward American expansion. Finally, Deloria also observes that indigenous people rarely criticize Christianity, quote, even with the great pressures that Christians brought to bear on tribal religions in the past century, end quote, while on the other hand, Christians regularly claim, quote, that Indians dwell in darkness and that their religion should be suppressed as quickly as possible, end quote. His perspective contrasts the tolerance of indigenous peoples with the intolerance often present among Christian people. Overall, Deloria utilizes the methods of comparison that scholars historically use to justify oppressive policies. Diverging from these scholars, however, Deloria polemically calls out Christians' hypocrisy for forcing their supposedly superior religion upon others, then neglecting to follow most biblical teachings themselves. Notably, Deloria criticizes Christian behavior, but still exemplifies the attitude of tolerance he observes in indigenous religion, as he calls Christians to become better, quote, representatives of Christianity. In conclusion, indigenous peoples of North America faced violence, legal restrictions, and racial prejudice, which directly threatened and prevented their ability to practice their beliefs. These examples of indigenous responses to religious oppression shows the importance of resistance, adaptation, and resilience in ensuring the survival of repressed religious practices. The adoption of Christian characteristics was a major method of survival since it made indigenous tradition more recognizable to the Christian outsider. However, it was also a major act of resistance since it essentially allowed natives to continue practicing their religion with less surveillance from Christian institutions or prejudiced government. The Native American Church, the secret performance of the Sundance, and the Ghost Dance all undermined the hegemony of Protestant Christianity in America. Modern criticisms correspondingly reversed the prejudiced narrative of indigenous and religious inferiority that was perpetuated within academic traditions. Analyzing these indigenous acts of resistance and adaptation also helps demonstrate the complexity and ingenuity of Native peoples, and it can hopefully help us move away from any sort of one-dimensional description or romanticization of indigenous culture. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and thank you again to the History Undergraduate Advisory Board for organizing this event, and to Professor Simon Joseph, who really helped me with my research project. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you have a great day.